Hi everybody, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I'm using a stamp set by Studio Katia called Spring Bouquet. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to watercolor this or color it with my Copics, so I'm doing both today. I'm going to be using Avery's liquid watercolors, which are brand new to me. I've never used them before, but I figured this is a good image to try that out with. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper as well as a piece of 80-pound Nina Solar white cardstock here, both cut to 5.5 by 4 1/4. I'm using my Misty to stamp my images, and for the watercolor, I am using Distress ink in the color Pumice Stone. Normally when I do no-line watercoloring, I use antique linen, but sometimes that's a little bit hard to see on camera, so I am using a little bit darker of a color and more of a gray tone. And for the Nina cardstock panel, I am using Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink because it is Copic safe. For my watercolor panel, I am using a number 6 and a number 4 brush by the Silver Brush Company, and I'm using the colors Sugar Plum and Celery. In this little palette here, I think I got it at Walmart for about $1, so I'm just going to add a few drops of each color in there. For the watercoloring, I kind of spread this out a little bit. I do one petal at a time, but I spread them out so that they're nowhere near each other just in case they're still wet. I don't want them to bleed together. I'm starting out by just layering a small amount of pigment where my darkest color will be. Right away, I noticed that the color that I chose for this is not very pigmented, so I wasn't sure that I was going to get too much dimension, and I didn't, but that's okay. It gave it a softer look. So I'm just taking a few petals here and putting down my lines for my darkest color and then letting them just sit there for just a little bit. Because it is liquid watercolor, they tend to stay wet a little bit longer, and I didn't want it to just all pool together. Next, I rinsed my brush and I dabbed most of the water off with a paper towel, and I just left it damp and then covered that petal with the water, just barely touching that pigment and letting that spread out. I went back and added a little bit more pigment to those darker areas and let that spread out a little bit. I just wasn't getting much dimension with this particular color that I chose. So when needed, I just added a little bit more while that petal was still wet. I'll go ahead and show you a few of these petals and then we'll move on to the leaves. I won't show you the entire card. It would take quite a while. I think this card took me well over an hour. So I'll just show you a few and show you a couple of the leaves, and then we'll move on to the Copics. For the leaves, I pretty much did the same thing. I went ahead and laid down where my darkest colors will be, either where that flower kind of lays over those leaves or where another leaf may be laying over that leaf, and then taking a very damp brush and just spreading out that pigment. Once the leaves were dry, I went ahead with just the paint, no water mixed in, and just added those veins within those leaves. I moved on to my Copics, and I am using for the flowers the V01, V04, V15, and V17. And I pretty much did the same thing. I started with my lightest color and just laid down where my shadows were going to be. And again, here I'll just show you the one flower, and then we'll move on to a couple of the leaves. Once my lightest color was laid out, I then went to my darkest color, and I'm barely touching the paper here. I just want a very faint line of the dark just to give it some contrast, but I don't want it to take over the entire flower, so I'm just barely touching the paper. Next, I moved on to my V15, and this is where I'm going to start flicking out some of that color. I'm going to start right over that darkest line that I put with the V17 and just flicking that out a bit. Next, I moved on to my V04, and I'm continuing with the flicking motion and just bringing that color out just a little bit more. I want these petals to be pretty light in the end, so I'm not taking it all the way. I'm going to leave the highlight pretty predominant in these flowers. Once that was done, I took my lightest color, which is the V01, and went over the entire flower. For my leaves, I'm using the G82, G24, and G28. I use this combination a lot for leaves. And again, I'm just starting with my lightest color and laying down where my shadows will be. This particular leaf has that one flower laying over some of it, so there will be a shadow there. And then I go to my darkest color, lay down my darkest areas as well as the veins. On the sides, there's pieces of the leaf that kind of fold in a bit, so I am adding a little bit of shading there as well. I didn't get enough dimension there, so I am going back with my darkest color, then my medium, then my lightest, just to add a little bit more dimension. Once both panels were done, I went ahead and took the watercolor panel there and I added some splatters to that leftover paint that I had in my palette. I just added a few drops of water and splattered that on and dabbed it up with a paper towel. I didn't let it sit there long enough so you can barely see it, so I went ahead and did that again and just let it sit there for a moment before I dabbed up that paint. For my sentiment, I'm using the My Favorite Things Anything But Basic Friendship stamp set. This has a lot of great sentiments. I'm using that large friend stamp and 2 different sentiments underneath for each card. I'll be using my Misty here, especially for the watercolor panel, because sometimes you do have to stamp that twice in order to get a good impression. I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink for the sentiments. This is a pigment ink, so make sure that you do let it sit for a few moments before you handle it. It will smear, but this is my favorite ink for sentiments. It gives you a really bold black sentiment. Once my sentiments were stamped out, I went ahead and trimmed down both panels on each side and on the bottom just a little bit and adhered those to A2 card bases using Tombow Mono Multi Glue. For the watercolor card, I am using Nuvo Jewel Drops in the color Pale Periwinkle and just adding a few drops around the flowers. And I'll do the same thing with the Copic panel, only I am using Violet Galaxy, which has a little bit of a metallic look. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by.